Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be exploring a translated Tamil poem called Hymn 10.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Nice.
We're going to be talking all about spiritual awakening and divine grace, and hopefully leave you with some stuff to think about.
I think this one's going to do it.
Me too. So to start off, the first line is, "If you desire, here is the moment where the great Lord, tested through grace, arrives." And I think that's super interesting right off the bat, you know? It's like that sense of urgency.
Yeah, like this window is open. You got to be ready.
Right, exactly. Like you have to be prepared.
You can't be passive. It won't just come find you.
Yeah.
You got to be seeking it out.
Yeah, and I think it's also cool how it says a great Lord tested through grace. Like, what does that mean to you?
Well, it makes me think about, all those stories about how you have to, go through the fire to come out stronger.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, this isn't just any Lord. This is a Lord who has suffered and come through it and understands that suffering.
Like they've been tested and they've passed.
Right? Like they're going to be so much more understanding and compassionate after going through that,
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so moving on to the next line, it says, "The Lord, both as the mother and the father, is the giver of grace." What do you think about that? This idea of the divine having two sides, like a motherly side and a fatherly side.
Well, it's trying to capture the whole picture.
Yeah.
Not just one part of it. Like you have that motherly side that's all about nurturing and love.
Yeah.
And then the fatherly side that's all about strength and guidance. So you get both,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like finding that balance between all the aspects.
Yeah, like yin and yang. You need both to be whole.
Right. Okay, so then we get to the third line, which says, "You who are devoted to the Lord have surrendered your mind and actions to Him."
Oh, okay.
And what does that word surrender even mean in this context? Because it can be kind of scary.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially now when we're all about being independent and in control.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you think it's trying to say?
Well, I don't think it means giving up making your own choices. I think it's more about the intention behind those choices.
Okay.
Like, are you coming from a place of ego and control, or are you trying to do something bigger than yourself?
Okay. That's really interesting.
Like aligning your will with something bigger, whether that's a higher purpose or the divine or whatever.
So it's more about letting go of that need to control everything.
Right. And I think that's something we can all work on.
Totally. And now get ready, because the next line is really powerful.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, boy.
"The all-powerful sage has merged with my soul."
Whoa.
Right. So intense.
Yeah.
What do you think is happening here?
Well, this is where it gets really mystical.
Yeah.
It's describing a full-on spiritual union, Like becoming one with the divine. Like the all-powerful sage represents that divine essence, and it's becoming one with the individual soul.
It's pretty amazing imagery.
Right.
So we've gone from desire to surrender and now to merging.
Yeah, this poem's taking us on quite the ride.
I know. And it doesn't stop there. The fifth line says, "In the public space, the grace and divine dance of realization are unfolding." So what do you think? What's going on in this line?
Well, I think it's saying that this isn't just happening in some far-off place. It's right here in our everyday lives.
Like we just have to learn to see it.
Exactly. And that's where grace comes in. It was not just a concept. It's an active force in the world.
It's all around us.
Right. So we don't have to search for it. We just have to open our eyes to it.
Okay, that's beautiful. Now we're getting to the sixth line, which says, "This is the auspicious moment when divine grace rises and the holy day has come."
Okay.
So now we have this big moment. What's the significance of that,
It's like it's saying, pay attention, this is important. Like we're on the verge of a breakthrough.
Right. Like it's all been leading up to this.
And there are certain times and situations that are just better for this kind of spiritual stuff.
Like those times when everything just clicks.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we've got the desire, the surrender, the merging, the grace, and this big moment. But then the seventh line comes in and says, "Do not be deceived by false words, O world, and fall into delusion." So why this subtle warning?
Well, it's like a little reality check, because the spiritual path isn't always easy.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There are going to be things that try to distract you and lead you astray, so you have to be careful.
Yeah, and that's especially hard now with all the information overload.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's harder than ever to know what's true and what's not.
Totally. So we have to be really discerning.
You gotta have that strong spiritual BS detector.
I love that. And finally, we come to the last line of this section. It says, "The form that lasts forever, transcending past, present, and future, is attained."
Oh, right. That's a big one.
I know, it feels like the culmination of everything. So what do you think it means to attain an eternal form?
Well, different traditions might have different interpretations. but I think the core idea is the same.
What do you mean?
Like, it's about realizing your true nature, your essence beyond your physical body and your ego, and even time itself.
So it's about transcending all the limitations.
Exactly.
Okay, that's so interesting. So we've journeyed from desire all the way to this eternal form.
It's a pretty wild ride.
It really is. And even though we've gone line by line, there's still so much to unpack about how all these themes connect.
Yeah, totally.
But before we get into that, I want to know what stood out to you the most in this first part.
That's a good question. I think that image of the divine dance unfolding all around us really stuck with me. It's so hopeful, you know? It's like spirituality isn't just a separate thing. It's everywhere. If we just learn to see it. What about you?
Well, I really like that idea of surrender and how it's not about weakness, but actually a way to become more powerful.
That's a good one. It's definitely counterintuitive.
It really is. But it makes so much sense when you think about it.
It does. It really does.
So now I'm curious to hear more about how all these pieces fit together. What's the main message of this poem? How does it all relate to us today? I think that's what I'm hoping we can explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, great.
It's like this poem is speaking directly to us. You know?
Yeah.
Even though it's so old.
I know, it's crazy. Like when it talks about those false words and delusion.
Right.
It's like you're talking about the internet or something.
Totally. Like with so much information coming at us all the time,
Yeah.
how do we even know what's real anymore?
It's so overwhelming.
And that's why it's so important to have that discernment, you know? Like that spiritual BS detector.
Yeah, totally. But how do we even develop that? Like, what are some practical ways to figure out what's true and what's not?
Well, I think it starts with just being more aware of the choices we make every day.
Right.
Like instead of just going through the motions, stop and think, is this coming from a good place? Am I acting out of fear or ego?
Ooh, that's a good one.
You know? Like really checking in with yourself.
Yeah. And trying to make choices that feel aligned with who we really are.
Exactly. And that ties in with that whole surrender thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's not about being passive. It's about choosing to align yourself with something bigger.
Okay.
Whether it's a higher purpose or the divine or whatever resonates with you.
So it's like actively choosing to let go of that need to control everything.
Right. And that's where the real power comes from.
It's funny how that works, you know?
Yeah.
Like the more you surrender, the more empowered you become.
It's counterintuitive for sure, but it's true. Think about it. When we're trying to force things, we just create resistance.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But when we let go and trust that there's a bigger plan, it's like things just flow more easily.
It's like swimming with the current instead of against it.
Exactly. And that's where that sense of abundance comes in, you know?
Yeah.
So scarcity and fear, it's like trusting that everything's going to work out.
That's a really good point. And remember that line about the divine dance unfolding all around us?
Oh, yeah.
It's like it's saying that these spiritual insights are everywhere.
Right. It's not just for monks on a mountaintop. It's for everyone.
Like we're all part of it.
Exactly. We just have to tune in.
So how do we do that? How do we become more aware of this grace that's everywhere?
Well, I think it starts with presence, you know? Like really paying attention to the world around us.
Okay.
Like instead of rushing through life, slow down and appreciate the little things.
Yeah, like actually tasting your food instead of just shoving it in your mouth.
Right. Or noticing the beauty of a sunset or the sound of the wind in the trees.
It's like being a kid again, you know? Everything is new and amazing.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be big things either.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like even just a small act of kindness from a stranger can be a moment of grace.
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so we've talked about surrender and grace, but what about that idea of eternal form? It's such a big concept. How does that relate to our everyday lives?
That's a really good question. You know, it's easy to get lost in the abstractness of it all.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it boils down to this. We are not just our bodies and our thoughts.
Okay.
There's something deeper within us, a spark of the divine, that connects us to something much bigger.
So it's like tapping into that part of ourselves that's eternal.
Exactly. And that's what I think the poem is pointing to.
But how do we even do that? Like, how do we connect with that eternal part of ourselves in a practical way?
Well, there are lots of paths. But I think one of the most important things is stillness.
Okay.
Whether it's through meditation or prayer or just taking some quiet time for yourself. The key is to quiet the mind.
Ah, so we can actually hear that deeper wisdom within us.
Right. It's like creating a space for that eternal form to emerge.
That's so cool. And speaking of that deeper wisdom, what about free will? If we're surrendering to this divine dance, does that mean we don't have any choice in how our lives unfold?
That's a big question. And one that people have been debating forever.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think the poem is actually pretty clear about this.
What do you mean?
Well, remember how it starts. If you desire, that implies choice. You know? You have to want to embark on this journey.
So it's not about being forced into anything.
Right. It's about choosing to align yourself with something bigger.
And in that alignment, we don't lose our individuality. We actually become more of who we truly are.
Exactly. It's like we're choosing to dance with the divine.
I love that analogy. It's beautiful.
But yeah, it's definitely a paradox, you know?
Totally. Like, how can we have both surrender and free will?
Right. It's a tricky balance.
It really is. So how do we make sense of that?
I think it's less about choosing one or the other and more about recognizing that both are always present.
Oh.
We always have choices. But those choices are always made within the context of this bigger dance.
So it's about learning to discern when to surrender and when to assert our where.
Right. Like when to go with the flow and when to paddle upstream.
It's like finding that sweet spot between effort and allowing.
Exactly. And that's a lifelong practice.
It really is. Okay, I have one more question before we move on.
Okay,
We've talked about surrender and devotion as paths to spiritual growth. But what about when things are hard? Like when we're going through suffering or loss? How do we find grace in those moments?
That's a powerful question. And one that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, we often think of grace as something positive and beautiful.
Right, like everything's easy and perfect.
Exactly.
Right.
But sometimes grace shows up in the darkest places, in the cracks of our brokenness.
Ooh, that's interesting.
It's like when we're going through tough times, we're more open to receiving support.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're more willing to be vulnerable, and that's where grace can enter.
It's like those difficult experiences can actually crack us open.
Right, and allow something new to emerge.
Something stronger and more resilient.
And that's where surrender comes in again.
Okay.
It's not about giving up. It's about surrendering to the present moment, whatever it may be.
So even in those hard times, there's still a lesson to be learned.
Exactly. And a deeper connection to be made.
To ourselves and to others.
Right. And that's the beauty of it, you know? Even in the midst of suffering, there's still grace to be found.
Okay, that's really hopeful.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of that divine dance again. Like it's always happening, even when we don't see it.
Totally. And the more we practice noticing it, the more attuned we become.
Like we're building a muscle.
Exactly. And that muscle helps us see the good even when things are tough.
Okay, so it's about shifting our focus from what's wrong to what's right.
Right. And from what's lacking to what's abundant.
It's a totally different way of looking at the world.
It really is. And you know what's really cool?
What?
We're not alone in this. You know, like we're all in this together.
Oh.
We can support each other and learn from each other.
And reflect back to each other the beauty that we might not see in ourselves.
Right. It's like we're all holding a piece of the puzzle.
And as we come together, the bigger picture starts to emerge.
Exactly. And that makes me think about that final line again. About attaining that eternal form.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it's not just about individual enlightenment, but about a collective awakening.
Like we're all waking up together.
Right. And recognizing our interconnectedness and our shared humanity.
That's a beautiful thought.
Yeah.
So how do we take all of this and actually apply it to our lives?
Yeah.
Like what are some concrete steps we can take to cultivate more grace and surrender and spiritual awareness? Okay, so let's talk about how we can actually put all of this into practice. You know, like we've talked about the ideas,
Yeah.
but how do we actually live them?
Right. It's one thing to understand it, but it's another thing to actually do it.
Exactly. So where do we even begin?
Well, remember that line about the divine dance unfolding in the public space?
Yeah.
It's like it's saying that we don't have to go to some special place to find this. It's all around us.
Okay, so we don't need to like go live in a cave or anything.
No, not at all. It's about shifting our perspective on the ordinary. You know? Like seeing the sacred in the everyday.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that? Like, give me some examples.
Sure, so let's start with something really simple. Like paying attention to your senses. Okay?
Like when you eat, really taste your food.
Uh-huh.
Savor the flavors and the textures.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of just shoveling food in my mouth sometimes.
I think we all are. But when we slow down and really pay attention, it can be a totally different experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else?
Well, the same thing with nature. When you go outside, take a moment to really feel the sun on your skin, or listen to the birds singing.
It's like hitting the pause button on life for a minute.
Exactly. And it doesn't just have to be pleasant experiences either.
What do you mean?
Like even when you're stuck in traffic, or waiting in a long line, instead of getting frustrated,
Yeah.
try to just observe what's happening within you.
Oh, that's
What sensations are you feeling in your body? What thoughts are running through your mind?
like being a scientist observing an experiment.
Yeah, exactly. And the more we do that, the more we create space between the stimulus and our reaction.
So we can actually choose how we respond.
Right, and that's where surrender comes in.
Oh, yeah. It's not about being passive. It's about consciously choosing to align ourselves with something bigger.
Whether it's our values or the divine or whatever.
Right. And that's a powerful thing.
It really is. So speaking of surrender, that was one of the things that really stood out to me from the poem. But it can be so hard to let go of control,
Yeah.
you know? Especially in our culture where we're always striving and achieving.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It goes against everything we're taught.
So how do we even begin to cultivate more surrender in our lives?
Well, one practice that I find helpful is starting each day with an intention.
Okay.
It could be something like, today I will let go of my expectations, or today I will trust that everything is unfolding as it should.
It's like setting the tone for the day.
Exactly. And as you go through your day, notice those moments when you're gripping too tightly.
Like when I'm freaking out about a deadline.
Exactly. Or when you're arguing with your partner. And instead of trying to force a solution, take a breath and ask yourself, what would it look like to surrender to this situation?
That's a good one.
You know, like trusting that there's a bigger plan at play.
Yeah, and letting go of that need to be right all the time.
Right. And you might be surprised by what happens when you do that.
Okay, I'm willing to try it.
Yeah.
So what about connecting with something bigger than ourselves? We've talked about that divine dance, but sometimes I feel totally disconnected from it. How do we tune back in?
Well, spending time in nature is a really powerful way to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Go for a walk in the park, sit by a lake. Just be present to the beauty and intelligence of the natural world.
It's like remembering that we're part of something much bigger.
Exactly. And you don't have to go on some big retreat to experience this. Even in a city, you can find little pockets of nature.
Yeah, like that one tree on my street that I always stop and look at.
Exactly. Take a few moments to connect with that living presence and allow yourself to be nourished by it.
Okay, that's beautiful. And what about for people who don't necessarily resonate with the idea of a divine presence? Are there other ways to connect with something larger than themselves?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It could be connecting with a community, volunteering your time, doing something kind for someone else.
It's like remembering that we're all interconnected.
Exactly. And that our actions have ripple effects.
So by helping others, we're ultimately helping ourselves.
Right. And as you do these things, pay attention to how they make you feel.
Like, do I feel more grounded, more peaceful?
Exactly. It's like tuning your instrument to harmonize with that divine dance.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today,
Yeah.
but I have one last question.
Oh, yeah, shoot.
The poem talks about attaining an eternal form, something that transcends time and space. Do you think we can experience that here on Earth? Or is it something that only happens after we die?
That's a big question, and I think it's one that each person has to answer for themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I believe that glimpses of that eternal form are available to us in every moment.
What do you mean?
It's about recognizing that spark of the divine within ourselves and within all beings. It's about connecting with that timeless essence that's beyond our physical form and our thoughts and emotions.
So it's not about waiting for something to happen. It's
Right.
about living from that place of connection right now.
Exactly. And expressing that divine spark through our actions and interactions with the world.
It's like embodying that eternal form in our everyday lives.
Right. And the more we do that, the more we contribute to a collective awakening.
A shift in consciousness that can transform the world.
Exactly. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Hymn 10.
It's been such a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
It really has.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Take these insights and these practices and see what happens when you apply them to your own life.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
Thanks for listening, everyone.